Have you ever just stopped and really listened to that little voice inside your head? I mean, it never shuts up, right? It's like a constant chatter, narrating our lives, you know? And get this, according to Michael Hyatt and Megan Hyatt Miller, they wrote this book, Mind Your Mindset. They say that inner voice, it's way more powerful than we realize. Like, it can actually shape what we think we can and can't do.
What's really interesting is that Hyatt and Miller aren't just talking about, the power of positive thinking. It's deeper than that. They're diving into how our brains are basically wired to create stories. And these stories, they're constantly running in the background, whether we're aware of them or not. And they're like these hidden architects shaping our wins and also holding us back sometimes.
And this isn't just some theoretical stuff. Michael Hyatt, he built this company, Full Focus. It's been recognized by Inc. 5,000, like 3 times, a super fast-growing company, and he's a best-selling author on top of that. Megan Hyatt Miller, she's the CEO now, also co-hosts this podcast, Lead to Win. So they've really seen these ideas play out in the real world.
Yeah, for sure. And the fact that some seriously big names have endorsed the book says a lot. Francesca Gino, she talks about how it helps us take charge of the stories we tell ourselves. Then you've got Dave Ramsey. He's all about how the book helps you figure out what's keeping you stuck. Bob Goff, he focuses on how powerful it is to have your inner world match up with, actual reality. And Dr. Henry Cloud, he's the one who uses that awesome phrase, storytelling machine, for our brains. Like, we can actually program ourselves for better results.
So today, our deep dive is all about these internal narratives. We're gonna get under the hood and try to figure out how they work, where they can trip us up, and most importantly, how we can become better storytellers, the kind that help us reach our goals. It's like a cheat sheet for understanding our minds with Hyatt and Miller as our, expert guides.
Yeah, and Dr. Cloud makes a good point. Just recognizing that our brain is this narrative factory. That's a huge first step. Once you see that, you start to see opportunities for positive change everywhere.
So, about this storytelling machine idea, the first chapter in the book is called The Brain That Tells Itself Stories. Seems pretty foundational, right? What's the main thing we need to understand?
It all boils down to how our brains are constantly trying to make sense of things, right? To create meaning. They do this by taking all these separate bits of information and weaving them together into stories that explain, like, how the world works. Think about a little kid trying to figure out how things work.
Oh, you mean like that story about Megan's daughter, Naomi, and the whole Gandhi boat thing at the lake?
Exactly. Naomi's brain is linking granddaddy, which she calls Gandhi, with boat and lake into a simple explanation of where the boat is and who it belongs to. It's a basic example of how the brain grabs these individual concepts and starts looking for connections to build understanding. And neurologically, it's fascinating. There are these things called concept cells. They're neurons that help us label and track everything around us.
So our brain's always labeling and filing information.
Yeah, exactly. And then the really important part is connecting those labeled concepts, which leads us to understanding cause and effect. When little Naomi drops her food and everyone reacts, her brain starts to build a story about actions and consequences. This drive to link ideas, it's incredibly powerful. Harvard professor Paul Harris, he estimates kids ask like 40,000 why questions between the ages of 2 and 5. That's how much we crave understanding. Wow, 40,000. Our brains are like little detectives from the get-go. So we've got these concepts, they get connected. That's how our internal stories get built. Now, Hyatt and Miller talk about this thing called the narrator. What is that exactly?
They talk about it in the second chapter, introducing the narrator. It's that inner voice that's always there, interpreting what's happening and constructing these narratives for us. And to understand how important this is, they use research from Michael Gazzaniga, the neuroscientist.
Oh, yeah. Those split brain studies, right? Those are always mind-blowing. Totally. Gazzaniga studied people who'd had their corpus callosum severed. That's the connection between the two halves of the brain. One patient, P.S., was really fascinating. Researchers could show things to only one side of his brain at a time. So, like, they'd flash a command to his right hemisphere and he'd stand up. But when asked why he stood up, remember, language is mostly processed on the left side, which didn't get the command. His left brain would just make up a reason, like, I wanted to get a drink.
So even without knowing the real reason, the brain just had to come up with an explanation. Like, it hates not having an answer.
Exactly. Gazzaniga calls this the interpreter, and Hyatt and Miller see it as very similar to their narrator idea. Our brains crave coherence, they need explanations, even if they have to make things up. And here's the crazy part. We're only aware of a tiny fraction of all this processing and storytelling going on in our heads. Makes you wonder how many of our reasons for things are just stories we tell ourselves after the fact.
It's like there's this whole movie playing in our minds, but we're only seeing, like, a few frames here and there. So brains are storytellers, the narrator's always working, but what about our own experiences and views? How do they shape the stories we tell ourselves? That's where assumptions and beliefs come in.
Right, got it. Chapter 3, How Your Brain Shapes Stories, is all about that. Hyatt and Miller point out our stories don't just pop up out of nowhere. They're shaped by our assumptions and the things we're trying to achieve. They even use a really good example from Michael's time as CEO of Thomas Nelson.
You mean that story about missing their financial goals back in July? And his talk with his executive coach, Eileen? That was really insightful.
Yeah, that one. Michael's initial explanation was the market's tough right now, gas prices, interest rates, people not spending as much, seemed totally logical based on facts. But Eileen, she pushed back. She asked why they specifically missed the target. And her point was, if they just blame everything on external factors, they're basically giving up control. They can't change the situation.
And that was a big realization for Michael. He says so in the book. By blaming everything on stuff outside their control, he was accidentally limiting their options. It's so easy to become victims of our own stories without even realizing it.
What's so insightful is that Michael's explanation, while seemingly objective, was actually a story shaped by the assumption that outside forces were to blame. And maybe unconsciously, the purpose of that story was to make them feel better, like, we're good, it's just the market's fault. It shows how our assumptions, even our motives, can subtly distort the narratives we create.
So even when we think we're just stating facts, there's usually interpretation mixed in. The book also talks about different types of memory and how they play a role.
Right, there's episodic memory, those are our personal experiences, and semantic memory, which is more about facts and general knowledge. Semantic memory is generally seen as more objective, but the more we replay those episodic memories, the more real and factual they feel, even if they were subjective to begin with. Like feeling anxious before a presentation, it can feel like a real objective danger, even though it's not a physical threat. It's those repeated memories of past anxiety hardening into a seemingly factual narrative.
And then there's the fact that memory itself isn't always reliable.
Definitely not. Hyatt and Miller quote both Frank Schaeffer and Philip Roth. They both talk about how memory can be distorted by time, prejudice, even our emotions. We tend to remember good things as better and bad things as worse than they really were. It's almost like our current mindset is going back and editing our memories.
So we're constantly rewriting our past to fit with how we see things now.
Kinda, yeah. And it's not just our own memories. Our relationships, the communities we're part of, they all influence our assumptions and the stories we tell ourselves. We rely on what others tell us, often without really checking if it's true or where it came from. Cognitive scientists Sloman and Fernbach, they even talk about this knowledge illusion. We think we know more than we do because we have access to the knowledge of people around us.
So it's a group effort, in a way. The stories we tell ourselves, friends, family, colleagues, the whole culture we live in, they all contribute.
They do. And to make those stories stick even harder, our brains actually reward us for believing them. When something happens that confirms our existing beliefs, we get this little hit of feel-good chemicals. So we naturally resist changing our minds, even when the results show that our beliefs might not be working for us. It's just easier to stick with what feels familiar.
Okay, so our brains make stories based on our assumptions, memories, and social circles, and then we get rewarded for sticking to them. Now, how does that big question of what's next fit into all this?
That's the heart of Chapter 4, Your Brain's Big Project. Hyatt and Miller say our brains are primarily focused on anticipating the future, always asking what's next, as a way to survive and thrive. They use this really cool painting by René Magritte, The Treachery of Images, to explain this.
Oh yeah, the one with the pipe and the caption that says, "This is not a pipe."
Yeah, that one. The point is, a painting of a pipe isn't a real pipe you can smoke. And in the same way, our thoughts and stories are representations of reality. They're not reality itself. They're like mental maps we create to navigate the world. And guess what has a huge impact on those maps? Our goals.
So the things we're trying to achieve actually shape the stories our narrator tells us about what's possible.
Exactly. Our goals become the plot lines for our internal narratives. They affect how we see things and what we do. And they illustrate this beautifully with the story of Hugh Hare, the rock climber who lost both his legs.
Oh yeah, incredible story of resilience. Doctors told him he'd never climb again, right? That was the story they projected onto him.
Right. The doctor's narrative, based on his experience and assumptions, was all about limitations. But Hugh Hare, he had a different goal. He wanted to climb again no matter what. And that powerful goal, It completely blew past those limiting assumptions and created a whole new narrative. He didn't accept the label disabled, he focused on the limitations of the prosthetic technology itself. And he ended up designing his own prosthetics that actually allowed him to climb in ways he couldn't before.
Such a powerful example of how the right goal can completely change our story and our limits. Makes you think, what limits are we accepting based on someone else's story for us?
It really shows how we're constantly creating these models of the world in our minds, like rehearsals for the future, to anticipate what's going to happen and figure out the best way to reach our goals. Our brain's always trying to guess what's next.
Okay, so these narratives are super powerful, but how do we actually take control of them? How do we tell the difference between the stories that help us and the ones that hold us back?
That's where part two of the book comes in. It's about learning to interrogate our narrator. The first step they outline is clarifying the facts, separating the what's, that's the objective reality, from the why's, our interpretations and explanations. They even mention the story of Adam and Eve, where God asks a bunch of what questions, and their answers are all why justifications. We're naturally inclined to jump to explanations.
It's like we have this need to fill in the blanks and make a coherent story, even if we don't have all the information.
Exactly. They share this great example from Ann Carr, who relied on a mentor to help her stay sober. Her mentor always asked, "What is your source of information?" And 9 times out of 10, Carr realized her beliefs were based on her own thoughts, not on actual facts from the outside world. It makes you think, is this belief something real, or is it just something I made up in my head?
So it's about being aware of the difference between what's actually happening and how we're interpreting it. Sounds simple, but I bet it's really hard to do all the time.
It takes practice. And when we're looking at the what's, we have to be careful about confirmation bias. That's our tendency to look for information that confirms what we already believe. They use the story of the quinoa price increase. It's a good example. At first, it seemed like higher prices were bad for local farmers, but it turned out they were actually making more money and had better diets because of it. We got to be careful about jumping to conclusions based on incomplete information.
The book also mentions how our language, especially metaphors, can affect how we think.
Yeah, metaphors are great. They help us understand complicated ideas by comparing them to simpler things, but they can also box us in. Like if we think of a project as a battle, we might only look for solutions that involve conflict and aggression instead of collaboration. Hyatt and Miller say we should try to strip away the metaphors to see the ideas clearly. Even the words we choose to describe a situation can limit our thinking.
And then there's the danger of blindly applying best practices, those universal truths, from one situation to another without considering the specifics.
Right. What works great in one industry or with one customer might not work at all in another. There's so many variables: demographics, staff, market conditions, and tons more. Statistician David Blasland said it well. Even if we understand 99% of the relevant factors, we can still be completely wrong about the outcome.
So to really question our internal narratives, we need to ask some tough
Yeah.
questions. What are we assuming? Why are we telling the story this way? Are we being objective? Can we actually prove what we believe?
Absolutely. The book gives us a bunch of helpful questions to check the logic of our narratives. They go back to Michael's coaching session, and by really digging into his story about the tough market, he realized his own leadership was part of the problem. That led to a more empowering story. And then there's Mikhail Kachet's experience. She had cancer surgery that affected her voice. By questioning her assumptions about what makes a good communicator, she realized things like empathy and truthfulness were more important than perfect speaking.
That's a great example of how challenging our assumptions can lead to a whole new understanding. Now, the book also talks about intuition, that gut feeling. How does that fit in?
Chapter 5, Trust Your Gut, but Verify, is all about that. Intuition, as they define it, it's like processing information below the level of our conscious awareness, so we just know something before we can explain it. They use this example of a Formula One driver who slams on the brakes to avoid an accident, just instinctively.
Like that immediate gut level feeling without needing to think it through step by step, almost like subconscious pattern recognition, right?
Exactly. They make a distinction between knowing through reason, which is evidence-based, and knowing through intuition, that gut feeling. Both are valuable, but in different situations. Intuition is helpful in complex environments, when there's a ton of data or when you have to make fast decisions. Reason is more critical for high-stakes decisions, where you need solid evidence. They even compare it to reasonable doubt versus preponderance of evidence in legal terms.
So intuition can be a starting point, but you shouldn't base a huge decision solely on gut feeling. Always try to verify it.
Yeah, they talk about George Kurian's approach at NetApp. He believes in making decisions with sufficient information, but not necessarily all information. It's a balance between speed and risk. The key is to verify your intuition whenever possible, use your intellect, and get input from others. And be aware of your own biases.
So trust your gut, but check it with your head and with other people. Now, all this questioning our beliefs and even our intuition can be kind of scary. The book talks about being comfortable with uncertainty, right?
Yes, chapter 6 is titled, Get Comfortable with Being Wrong, which is very fitting. They use George Kurian again. He went from being a meticulous engineer to a leader who has to make quicker decisions in incomplete information. It's about learning to be okay with not knowing everything, for sure.
Because our brains are wired to look for certainty and consistency, even if that certainty is based on a wrong story.
Exactly. We don't like changing our minds because it disrupts our sense of stability. Megan talks about her own fear of public speaking and how the stories her narrator was telling her about failing felt totally real, even though they were holding her back. They even bring up a prediction from Søren Kierkegaard. He said, anxiety would become more common in a fast-changing world because our old ways of seeing things wouldn't work anymore.
Like when our internal map of reality doesn't match the actual world, it creates anxiety.
Yeah. They talk about the historical influence of movements like empiricism and rationalism, which emphasize reason and observation. Those were important, but they also led to this overconfidence in the idea of absolute certainty. And that can make us less willing to question what we think we know. They use examples from science, like Copernicus, Galileo, and Hubble, to show that even scientific knowledge is always changing and evolving.
So we need to tell the difference between like moral principles, which are more solid, and other beliefs that we should be open to questioning.
Exactly. The fear of our whole belief system falling apart can stop us from looking closely at individual ideas. Hyatt and Miller encourage us to be humble, to be open to new information and different viewpoints. And they emphasize that uncertainty, while uncomfortable, can actually be a sign of new possibilities. They say we should hold our beliefs lightly, be willing to examine and change them, instead of defending them at all costs.
So we've talked about identifying our narrator, how it creates stories, how to question those stories, the role of intuition, and being okay with not knowing everything for sure. Now for the fun part, how do we actually rewrite our stories?
That's what part 3 of the book is all about, creating more empowering narratives. They make this interesting point that our existing neural pathways, or like well-worn paths in our brains, can make it hard to even imagine new possibilities. They use an example of Michael at a conference. He had some bad experiences with people from different cultures in the past, and it was making it hard for him to connect with people at the conference.
So we can get stuck in familiar ways of thinking, even if they're not good for us.
Yeah. So the first step is to cultivate what they call a possibility mindset. And they introduce this technique called thought swapping, basically challenging limiting beliefs by reframing them in a more positive way. They give examples like changing, I could never do that, to what steps could I take to make that possible?
So it's about shifting our focus from limitations to exploring possibilities.
Right. And a great way to do that is by asking open-ended questions that encourage exploration. Instead of asking, why did this bad thing happen? Ask, what can I learn from this? Or what new opportunities might this create?
They also talk about challenging conventional wisdom, those commonly accepted ideas.
Yes. They point out that many breakthroughs came from people who questioned the status quo. Like Steve Jobs, he was obsessed with simplicity, and Marie Curie broke all kinds of barriers in science. They say being willing to challenge what everyone thinks can spark new ideas.
And then there's this thing called counterfactual thinking.
Yeah, that's asking what-if questions to stretch our thinking. Like, what if I knew I couldn't fail? Or what if I had unlimited resources? These questions can help us see past our perceived limitations. They also talk about brainstorming stupid or crazy ideas to loosen up and come up with truly original solutions. They encourage a beginner's mindset, approaching problems with fresh eyes, asking even obvious questions. And finally, they say to tinker and experiment with new ideas, see them as learning experiences rather than final solutions, which helps overcome fear of failure.
So it's about disrupting our old thought patterns and making room for new, better stories. And we don't have to do this alone, right? They talk about the importance of outside perspectives.
Definitely. Chapter 9, More Brains Are Better Than One, is all about that. They share this story about Albert Einstein. He was a genius, but even he got stuck sometimes, partly because he wasn't open to input from others. His own professor said Einstein didn't like being told what to do.
So even the smartest people need feedback and fresh ideas.
For sure. Megan talks about how she relied on her team, her sister, and her speaking coach to help her overcome her fear of public speaking. Other people's perspectives give us access to their neural connections, which can help our narrator imagine stories we couldn't come up with on our own. Hyatt and Miller are big proponents of coaches, consultants, and counselors. They help us see flaws in our thinking and improve our performance, like Anders Ericsson's work on deliberate practice shows.
It's not just about formal coaching, though. Even casual conversations can spark new ideas.
Absolutely. They talk about the famous hallway at Bell Labs, where random chats between people from different departments led to a ton of inventions. It's called lateral thinking. They also mention the invisible obvious, those blind spots in our culture that are obvious to outsiders. Research on platforms like Incentive shows that innovative solutions often come from people whose expertise is in a completely different field. They share Dr. Patricia Bath's story. She pioneered laser cataract surgery. But her peers were skeptical at first, maybe because they were too close to the problem.
So talking to people with different viewpoints, even people we disagree with, can lead to better ideas.
Yes. A professor at the University of Michigan, Scott Page, calls this the diversity bonus. Hyatt and Miller give some practical advice for getting diverse perspectives. Talk to people from different backgrounds, go to conferences outside your field, read authors from different cultures. The key is to ask, who sees this problem differently than I do?
By opening ourselves up to different viewpoints, we can break free from our own limited thinking. Now, sometimes the best way to find new solutions isn't by forcing it, but by letting our minds wander, right?
Totally. Chapter 10, Let Your Mind Run, is all about that. Michael shares an example of struggling with a writing project and then having a breakthrough after taking a break. And they mentioned Thomas Kuhn. He had his aha moment while reading Aristotle, which shows how insights can happen when we're not even trying.
Like our brains are working on things in the background, even when we're not consciously thinking about them.
Exactly. Reimagining our stories often means finding new connections between things we already know. And the brain does this by trying to match new situations with existing neural pathways. Hyatt and Miller introduced two main brain networks: the executive network for focused, conscious thought, and the default network for subconscious processing and creativity. Creative insights happen when these two networks work together, which means we need both focus and rest.
So it's like our focus attention sets things up, and our subconscious mind makes connections that our conscious mind missed.
Perfect analogy. They also talk about navigating a traffic jam. If you have multiple routes, you can avoid getting stuck. And they mention how internet search engines evolved, from categories to keywords to backlinks. It shows how the brain explores different connections. When we consciously think about a problem, it primes the default network to find relevant, even unexpected connections. They also highlight the importance of sleep and naps for creativity. That's when the default network is really active. Megan and Joel even came up with a new product idea during a long car ride just by having a random conversation. It shows how those wrong turns in our thinking can lead to great solutions.
So sometimes the best thing to do is step away and let our minds wander. Now, we've covered a lot: identifying, questioning, and rewriting our narratives, getting diverse perspectives, and letting our minds roam. How do we make all these changes stick? How do we make the narrator our ally?
That's the focus of the last chapter, making the narrator your ally. They share Renee's story. Her narrator went from telling her, you can do anything, to making her feel limited after having kids, and then to a new, empowering narrative as a leader in aviation. It shows we can change our self-narratives.
It's a constant journey of self-awareness and growth, not a one-time fix.
Exactly. They share Michael's example. He used to get super anxious before speeches. His sister helped him replace his fear-based stories with positive affirmations, which made him a much better speaker. Then they give some practical tips for retraining our narrator, celebrating small wins to build momentum, and reading positive affirmations out loud to reprogram our inner voice. And they bring back Hugh Hare. He's a great example of someone who keeps reimagining possibilities and creating better stories for himself. The chapter ends by acknowledging the collaborative nature of knowledge and thanking their team, family, and mentors.
So to wrap up our deep dive into Mind Your Mindset, what are the big takeaways?
The main idea is our brains tell stories, and those stories shape how we see the world and what we believe is possible. If we learn how those narratives are formed, how to question them, how to be okay with uncertainty, how to rewrite limiting stories, how to get different perspectives, and how to let our minds wander, we can achieve more in every area of life.
It's about becoming the author of our own stories, instead of just passively accepting the ones we're given.
Exactly. Mind Your Mindset is a practical guide for changing our thinking and creating better stories for ourselves.
And for you, the listener, here's a final thought. Think of one limiting story you tell yourself. Maybe it's about your abilities, your relationships, or your future. What if you challenge that story? Maybe use some of the self-coaching questions from the full focus self-coacher mentioned in the book. What new possibilities could open up just by questioning that one story? It's something worth exploring. And if you want to learn more, definitely check out Mind Your Mindset by Michael Hyatt and Megan Hyatt Miller.